Hello, my name is Tiago Pimentel, and I'll present this work called Disambiguatory Signals are Stronger in Word Initial Positions. This was joint work with Ryan Cotterell and Brian Roark. So, the main research question we're trying to answer here is if word initial segments are more informative for disambiguation than word final ones. In other words, is it easier to guess the ending of dino or the prefix of sar? And the main challenge here is coming up with a measure of information to be able to measure this difference. And one way we could do this is by running psycholinguistic experiments with human subjects. And this was done by several previous work, which usually conclude that word initial segments are more important for humans than word final ones. And although this is interesting in its own right, it's not exactly what we're trying to measure here, since this does not measure how informative segments are in the abstract, only how useful they are for humans. Another way we could go around this is looking at information-theoretical measurements on natural corpora. So the most common way to do this would be to estimate a segment's information as its contextual entropy, where this is a character and these are the previous characters in the word. So this equation measures the information provided by a character given the previous ones in the same word. And it measures this information by its entropy. So as an addendum, Shannon's entropy is a measure of information, and a random variable is maximally informative when uniformly distributed, and minimally informative when deterministic. So if we apply these concepts to a character in a word, a character is maximally informative when you could pick any other character in that position, but minimally informative when you already know that character before looking at it, and so it's deterministic. So going back to this equation of the contextual entropy, there is a problem of using it for this study, which is that it has an inherent confound between the context size and the word position. And several previous work have used this metric to investigate this problem. So this leads us to question if this measure actually captures a property of the lexicon or simply an information-theoretical confound. Let me try to be clear. Conditioning information can only reduce entropy. That's a fact from information theory. And so if word position has a confound with the size of the context, then it will also have a confound with the amount of conditioning information, and which will lead to lower information in word final halves, just because of this information theoretical property. So let's consider an artificial language where every word contains a copy of its first half. So you have words like fufu, barbar, fubar, fubar. And in this language, we can see that initial and final halves have identical disambiguatory strength, because by design they are the same. But the conditional surpriso is almost zero for all the second halves, which exposes the distinction between conditional surpriso and disambiguatory strength. So to give another example of this, we ran a control experiment. And here is the results for the left to right contextual entropy per position. So we see that later word positions have smaller entropies, which is the conclusion from also from previous work, that word initial surpriso is stronger. But if we flip the word and run a right to left contextual entropy instead, we see the opposite effect. Looking at these results, it suggests that at least a large part of the result that is being captured is actually just this information theoretical confound. And to be clear, We'll call this the forward surprisal because it's going forward in the word, and this the backward surprisal now on this presentation. So we propose 3 measures which control for context size to investigate this question. The first one is unigram surprisal, which measures the full information a segment conveys, or the information a segment conveys when you know nothing else about the word. Closed surprisal measures the non-redundant information a segment conveys, or how much information a segment conveys given that you know the whole rest of the word. And the final one is the position-specific surprisal, which conditions a segment on its word position and on the word length. And this model was inspired by experiments from Nooteboom and van der Vlugt, which we'll explain further later in the presentation. So we used 3 data sets for our analysis. The first one is Selex, the second Narferolex, and the final Wikipedia, which are very different between themselves. Selex only covers 3 related languages. Narferolex covers more than 100 languages from distinct language families, but all from Europe and Asia. And Wikipedia we picked 41 typologically diverse languages. And this was important for a study because we could include languages which were strongly prefixing, for example, which were missing from the other 2 data sets. Selex also has morphemic information, so we can filter its lexica to only include monomorphemic words for our study. Narferolex has concept-aligned word lists, and these lists are based on basic concepts, which in some form also control for monomorphemic words, or at least base words, which are present in most of the language's lexicon. And Wikipedia has no phonetic information, so we use graphemes instead of phonemes. The other 2 datasets we used phonemes. And it also includes no morpheme information, so we use the 10,000 most frequent words for each language that we analyze. So let's go into our results. When we look at forward surprisal, we see that all but 1 language have significantly stronger word initial surprises. And when you look at the plot, we can see that there is a very strong front-loading effect across all languages, and in this plot, the gray line shows the identity line between both initial and final surprises. When we look at backward surprisal, though, we see that several languages have stronger word final surprises, although a few still have stronger word initial surprises, which is interesting. And when we look at the plot, it's much more nuanced, the results we get. When we look at both of them together, we can see there is both a large effect of the amount of conditional information that you give at each position, but also a lexical effect of front-loading disambiguatory signals. But it's hard to disentangle both things and conclude anything from these results alone. So now let's move on to the controlled metrics instead then. In here, we can see that there is indeed a cross-linguistic tendency to front-load disambiguatory information, since most of the languages do present stronger word initial surprises. But this is not a universal phenomenon, and some languages even have an opposite effect of more informative word final segments. And this is after controlling for the multiple statistical tests. In here, we can see a plot of the close initial versus final surprisal, and we see that all the results are much closer to the identity line than with the previous metrics as well. Looking more closely at the results, we see that when we control for morpheme information and look at the closed reprisal, only roughly half the words, half the languages present this front-loading effect. And when we look at the position-specific reprisal more specifically, we find the weakest results, which is interesting since this model was related to some previous work from Psycholinguistic, which investigated how easy it was to recover lexical items from the beginning or endings of the words. What Noteboom found was that it is easier to recover words from their beginnings in general, but that when you prime people with the length of the word, this difference vanishes. And this effect of priming people with the length or the position of a character in the word is related to how we built this position-specific reprisal model. So our conclusions from this paper are that there is indeed a cross-linguistic tendency to front-load disambiguatory information, but unlike previous work, we believe this is not a universal phenomenon, and that how we define information has a strong impact on our findings, and that we should be carefully about the biases in our estimates. So thank you, and I'll see you at the QA session.